All right, thank you so much, Brittany. My name is Ariel, as Brittany said, and this is Yancey.
Hi everyone, how are you doing?
We're really excited to talk to you today about best practices with the Common Application and navigating really what we see as admissions counselors, giving you a peek behind the screen, if you will.
Absolutely. So I think as we get started, to share a little bit of the agenda, we're going to talk about Macalester, so you have some familiarity about who we are and what we do. And then we're going to talk a little bit about holistic review and committee-based evaluation. And then we'll go over the common application section by section. At the end, we're going to talk a little bit about some other considerations, but we'll also have a point in the middle of the presentation for questions, but we'll also have some at the end as well. So yeah, so with that, let's get into start to talk about Macalester. So Macalester is one of the few liberal arts colleges that you'll find located in a metro area, which is going to be really important for students that attend Macalester, as being in the metro area is really going to help students when it comes to things such as internships, community engagement, research, and so on. We have students that are coming from all around the country and coming from all around the world as well. And in particular, with a focus on multiculturalism, Macalester today, in terms of our student body, is 26% students of color. And we're proud to say that that representation of students of color on our campus has gone up 51% since 2009. So we're really excited about how we have been moved forward with how we're diversifying our student body. And one of the big helps in that is our partnership that we've gone into with Questbridge. We're now in our fourth year in partnership with Questbridge, and it's been really great in helping us support students of color that we have here on campus. Additionally, Macalester meets 100% of demonstrated financial need for all of our admitted students. And so with that, we know that a lot of liberal arts colleges, when students see that price tag, that sometimes that can scare them a little bit, but knowing that we are really trying to do what we can to help support students here at Macalester. And so you'll see with our average need-based financial aid package of about $48,000, that we're really offering a lot of support for our students. In addition, we're providing merit scholarships as well. So with all this that's going on here at Macalester, we're really being recognized as a global leader among liberal arts colleges.
Great, thank you.
So now let's talk a little bit about holistic review and committee-based evaluation and how that fits into the work that we do in the Common Application. So back in a couple years ago, starting with our fall 2017 reading season, Macalester made a choice to switch over to committee-based evaluation. So that means that we went from going with kind of like a one person reviews the file that gets passed over to another reader to review the file, and then at the end we kind of have committee. We switched over to committee-based evaluation where there's two counselors actually reading the application at the same time. And this switch was rooted in the hope of really having our application review be more holistic, really allowing us to have more fruitful conversations and how we are reviewing the applications of the students that are applying to Macalester. And so I believe that we've seen a lot of fruit from that labor. So the class that we started reading with in fall 2017, who entered in the fall of 2018, was the largest and most diverse class in Macalester's history. So again, this idea of holistic review, we want to make sure that you're keeping that in mind as we go through each part of the application, of the Common Application.
And we're not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about that because we could have a whole nother webinar on committee-based evaluation, but important to note that that's a part of our process here at Macalester.
Yeah, so with that, we'll get started with talking a little bit about the profile page of the Common Application. I'll let Ariel take that away.
Great, thanks. And so just to note for all of you that we will be walking through every section of the Common Application today, and you'll notice that there are two different student names. So we use two different students and their applications to integrate into one to really demonstrate the things that we wanted to highlight for you all today. So if you do notice that, that's why. So starting off with this first page, this is the first thing we see when we open an application, and it's really useful just in terms of getting some of that basic information under our belts. So as I said, get the baseline information. So things that stand out, of course, are students' race and ethnicity, and it's really important that students list that accurately and do actually list that. Some students neglect to list that, but it's important that they identify themselves however they identify. And then, of course, other languages spoken. So if a student can speak 2 to 3 other languages, we want to see that, and it's helpful for us to see what their depth of knowledge is with those other languages, whether it's their first language, spoken at home, etc. And then of course, geography and citizenship. So if they're from the US, and if not, how many years they've spent in the US and their original birthplace. Again, just making sure that students fill that out with attention to detail and accuracy. So some common mistakes to avoid, as I said, really encouraging students to identify honestly and however they identify, not playing the diversity game, and then again, just making sure that students do list any language that they speak.
All right, so now we're gonna then go a little bit further into the application where we get to the family page. So then on the family page, we're now looking at the family of the other student in which we're going to be talking about today. And as we're getting into this family page, we're really starting to get into the context in which the student is coming from. So, in this situation, we might learn that, the student is coming from a married household, or their parents might be divorced, or it might be simply a single family situation. And so as we're looking at this, we're starting to learn more and more about the context that is coming up behind the student. And context is going to be key throughout this whole process. And when we come to holistic review and the work that we do in reading applications, that context is really important in every single part of the application that we're going to be talking about. And so when it comes to the family page, in addition to that context being important to the process, we're focusing not so much on what the parents do or don't do, but we rather want to know if the context in which the student is coming from has any influence on the student and their experience. Additionally, this is where we really start to find out information about something that is really important to us in terms of the classes that we're trying to put together every year, and that's a representation of first generation status within our class. And so here you'll see that, in the education that we're looking to see, what is the parent's background, and again, what influences that have on the student. And so as we're looking at this, it's important to know that, some schools have different definitions for how they designate first generation. In terms of Macalester's, definition, first generation to us means that neither parent or guardian has a bachelor's degree from any country. So we do have some students whose family are coming from another country, or they received education in another country. If they received their bachelor's degree over there, then they wouldn't qualify as first generation. The one kind of caveat to that is that if the parents have received their bachelor's degree within the last 5 years, then we're going to consider that student first generation, because they haven't had the opportunity to kind of benefit from the college knowledge as it's kind of like so new to the family. So that's something that we also take into consideration, particularly when we're talking about first generation college status here at Macalester.
Great. So with the education page, this page is really important, particularly for students who have switched schools, to list every school that they've attended, or for students who have college classes under their belt, whether those are through PSEO or Running Start, or some kind of concurrent enrollment program. So it's important to list all of those different institutions, and then we'll talk more about GPA and class rank with the high school transcript in just a couple slides, but it's important that students do note anything related to those topics in that section accurately. And then really here, the current or most recent courses, it's helpful for us to see what students list here and be able to corroborate that with the transcript. So again, just really having that eye for detail and attention to an accurate picture. Other things to consider: if a student is involved with a CBO, we definitely want to know that, and this is a great place to list that. And if students have honors that they've been awarded, we love to see that, and it's great. It's just one great way that students can put their best foot forward to demonstrate how they are achieving inside or outside the classroom.
So with that, if we have any burning questions that are kind of sitting out there now, otherwise we can go ahead and jump into the transcript. So do we have any?
Yeah, so there was one question that asked, can you expand a bit on your reference to the diversity game and what exactly you mean by that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that that we know that as colleges are actively making an effort to become more and more diverse. That when it comes to students kind of feeling like if I put this here, that is going to give me a better chance to get in. And that's not necessarily the case. I think sometimes what happens is that students might try to throw something out there in the demographic section, hoping that as long as I put that there, that it's going to give me a chance to kind of like stand out in the process. But it's important to remember that all these different parts of the application, they speak to each other and they work in conjunction. So if the students are going to kind of like list something about their demographic there in that section, understanding that will that come up to play in another part of the application? Is that an active part of their identity? Because again, what we also can see kind of on the back end as we're getting like a lot of information about students from other places, that sometimes that information doesn't match information we might be getting from College Board. It doesn't match information that we're getting from ACT if they happen to take the ACT or not. So just understanding that when it comes to that we want to make sure that students are just being, I guess, more truthful about the process, and understanding that we want to make sure that when we are bringing diversity onto our campus, that we're making sure that that we're representing that diversity in a meaningful way, because we look at this more than just as a check box on the application. We really want a lot of these different identities represented on our campus.
And I will also add, this wasn't represented in the profile page, but if a student is transitioning gender-wise, that profile page is a great place to list their how they identify and their preferred gender pronouns as well.
Absolutely. Was there any other burning questions?
Yeah, so there have been a couple questions about sort of overall context of the school. Some schools don't provide GPAs, and so what do they fill in for that section? Some schools have different AP or IB courses. So if you could talk a little bit about, for our audience, sort of how we would look at different school contexts within an application.
Absolutely, and I think that actually is a good chance for us to kind of move ahead, because that's actually the next section we're going to start to talk about is transcripts and the school profile. So going into the transcript, we're looking at a sample transcript for one of our students, Wilson. And so in doing that, generally speaking, I think a lot of students, and particularly even some counselors, I think the first thing that we're looking for is that GPA, that number. And it's important to note that number can look so many different ways in so many different contexts. So, some schools are on a 4.0 scale, some schools are on a 5.0 scale, some schools are even on a 6.0 scale when they kind of factor in weighted grades. Some schools are on a 100-point scale, some give stars, some give stickers, some don't really give anything at all. They just do a long summary. And so again, we know that because there's so many different ways that number can be chopped up, that our focus is not on what that number is, but we actually dive deeper into the transcript and start to look at some of the trends that go from there. So from there, you can start to see in this case for Wilson that, as we're getting in, one, we note that he transferred from another school. So that's one thing that we kind of take into consideration, is like, what information do we have about the old school versus the new school? And now with the current school that Wilson is at, what are we starting to see? In this case, we're starting to see Wilson pick up some C's, and he's picking them up as he goes further and further in. But we also notice that those C's are pretty much limited only to his math classes, so which tells us that he might not be very strong at math. So we kind of look at that. We also look at, like I said, trends. So we can also see that as he is picking up some of these C's and is taking a few less kind of like actual hardcore academic classes for each term, that we're seeing that GPA dip down little by little. But as we get into the senior year, we start to see that again, another thing that we're also really trying to take into consideration is that rigor. And so when it comes to rigor, that again, we do like to see students take advantage of AP classes, IB classes, honors classes, and whatever is available in that school context. But we also do want students to be able to challenge themselves in an appropriate level. So in this case, if I were Wilson's counselor at his high school, would I say that he has to take AP calculus because that's going to be the only way that he's going to impress a college or university? I wouldn't necessarily say that. I would more so, again, want him to challenge himself in the areas that he's really interested in. And in some cases, students are interested in all subjects, and that's where they challenge themselves, as long as they know and have taken that stock to understand that that's how they're challenging themselves. I think that's more important than anything else. So again, when it comes to the transcripts, again, that's Generally, when we're reading applications, right after we kind of like open that first page to see who the student is and where they're from, in most cases, we're trying to jump into that. And in our case, in terms of our committee-based evaluation, one person is kind of like over the transcripts and the school context part, while the other person is reading is kind of looking at all the other aspects of the application. So we're kind of reading those at the same time. But when it comes to transcripts, again, the focus is not on GPA, but on grades, trends, and rigor. And if anything feels shaky or seems shaky, again, do they have other parts of the application to be able to explain that away? So some things to avoid when it comes to the transcripts and the academic record is that wanting to make sure that there's no mismatch between academic performance and academic goals. So for example, one thing that does come into play where we're, for example, seeing those C's in math. While we, Macalester as a school, do not admit students by major or by department, we admit them to the school as a whole. Sometimes what's happening is if that student is saying that, they might be interested in engineering or something that's math-based, and we see that they are traditionally, not doing well in their math classes, that at least raises the question for us, is this student prepared or will they be able to, again, handle the rigor of some of the math classes that we're going to be taking here? And then additionally, if a student is thinking about, what type of school they want to go to, that just kind of having those things into consideration. Additionally, another mistake to avoid is avoiding rigor altogether. Now, we know that in some cases that students cannot avoid that because, again, the school does not offer AP or honors classes, but that's okay. That's where we start to learn more. That's why the context is important. So then we know that is this student avoiding rigor because the classes weren't there, or are they not having that rigor as we traditionally see it because like we know that they have all the classes and the student really just didn't take them. So again, that's where the context comes into play. So we can know that if a student is not taking AP classes, what does that mean within that school's context?
So moving on to testing, and I think Yancey did a great job laying out the importance of the curriculum, really seeing what classes are offered at a student's high school, how many of those rigorous courses have they taken, and what does their performance look like over time. Ultimately, that is a better indicator for us of if a student will be successful at Macalester. That shows us how they've been able to progress through a challenging curriculum. And testing is an important indicator too, but of course it is one snapshot, one day, or sometimes 2 or 3 days. And we are having conversations here at Macalester about becoming a test optional school. But as it stands, we do require either the ACT or the SAT, and students are allowed to self-report their test scores. So here we see on the testing page the list based on the date that the ACT was taken and then those sub-scores. And of course we see that the math sub-score is a little bit, well, actually significantly lower than the other scores. And so that sort of adds up. That makes sense based on what we've seen from the transcript. So just a couple other things here. One common mistake to avoid, I think sometimes we talk to students on the road or here who are visiting Macalester, and they're worried because they feel that their test score does not indicate their intellectual abilities. And so just really driving home that the test score is a part of the application, but it's a small part, and there are lots of other parts that show us who a student is and how they can succeed. And because we have this holistic review, again, it's one part, but it's not the end all be all.
Absolutely. And I think otherwise, again, it's also, again, remembering where context comes into play, that some students might be coming from areas where, again, we would maybe see, for example, here at Macalester, average, historical kind of like last few years, we tend to, have an average ACT, for example, of somewhere around a 30 or so. That doesn't mean that if a student has a 23 or a 24, that they have no chance of getting in. It's important to remember that when we talk about holistic review, that testing is one part of a larger conversation. And then not only that, that the student also might be coming from a place where test scores are not really strong in the area, period. So maybe a 23 at a school where the average ACT is a 17 or an 18 means that student is standing out in their context. Whereas if a student has a 23 and the average at their school is a 32 or a 33, that means something completely different. And so again, just understanding that context comes into play when we're talking about testing as well. And again, that's going to be one piece that we're we're going to be looking at in addition to grades, in addition to all the other stuff that we see in the application as well. So really don't let testing drive the conversations, because that's just one piece of what we're going to be looking at as we talk about holistic review.
Mm-hmm.
So now we'll get a little bit into the extracurricular activities. So again, when it comes to extracurricular activities, and it's important to know that with these different extracurriculars, that the idea is that we're looking for impact and not just titles. And so as we're trying to learn more about the student, we're starting to get a sense of the student outside of the academic context, and we want to get a sense of how the student is spending their time outside of the classroom. So activities such as jobs, family responsibilities, maybe they're doing a summer program at another college, or even CBO involvement. And as we mentioned before, that CBOs can be listed on the academic kind of like page from the application. Sometimes that is limited to the database that the Common Application actually has, and sometimes your particular CBO may not be listed there.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes it's important for students to be able to list this here, because they might be accomplishing a lot of great things, or maybe even the CBO they're a part of, they have to be selected to be part of it. And it's important to start to get some of that information so we can know that, like, how important that program is. So I think some things that we want to try to avoid when this is happening, things such as spelling and grammar, which I think is the case for all parts of the application, but also thinking about filling out the list, because again, there's 10 spaces that you have in order to fill out the extracurricular activities, and sometimes students are in a race to try to fill out 10 things. And I know students are amazing and are doing a lot of different things, but again, thinking about this not so much as trying to prove to us that you're doing a lot of things, but we want to see that impact. So if a student is going to list, for example, 10 different things, and what you'll end up seeing on the extracurricular activities is that it also asks, which years they're doing that activity, how many hours a week, and how many weeks a year that they're doing that activity, that we really get to see a sense of that. So in this case, this is an example of Wilson's extracurricular activities, and you see he's engaged in some things and has some continued involvement in such as debate, Chinese club. In comparison, looking at Brittany, we're seeing that she's also engaged in some things. Again, she's really engaged with her music in her youth group. And you see that she's starting to get engaged in some activities related to therapy and helping other people. And so just know that as we see this, sometimes we might see a student that will fill out 10 things, but all of them look like 12 hours. They only did it in 12th grade or in 11th grade, and it's only for a few hours a week. And so again, some students are in that race to try to fill it out. And again, it's not about how many you do; it's about the impact and the quality of the actual extracurricular activities that the student is taking part in. And then additionally, we want to make sure the students are also not lacking description for the activities that you're doing as well. So yeah.
Yeah, just to add on to that, I think this is one of the places in the Common Application when students sometimes just speed through it. And so we really want to emphasize that this is a great opportunity for students to put their best foot forward. And since at Macalester and many of our peer institutions, we really do thoughtfully consider how students are involved in communities and how they would contribute here on our campus, it's great if we can see those longer descriptions, and they don't have to be long narratives, but if we only see a title and we don't know what the club or organization is, then that leaves us with questions. But if students take the time to really explain to us why these commitments are meaningful to them or how they've been able to have an impact in their community, that certainly stands out, and that is one way that students really can put their best foot forward.
All right, so now we're going to transition and talk a little bit about essays. And so what we're actually going to do is we're going to show you two different essays, one of them being the personal essay and another one being the supplemental essay. And so we're going to give you a couple minutes for each of those to read through. So the first one is going to be the personal essay. Okay, and then now we're gonna switch over to the supplemental essay. All right. And so now I know we were kind of speeding through that, so you may not have gotten to the end of either one of those. But I think, again, just to kind of talk a little bit about those two essays. Those are both essays from Wilson, I believe. And with that, again, I think they were average essays for what we would tend to see here. They're fine. They were written just fine. I wouldn't say there's anything wrong with them per se. And that's completely okay. That every essay that a student writes doesn't have to be like knock it out of the park, winner type of an essay. More than anything, it's about learning about the student. So again, with these essays, it's really important that students are taking this opportunity to share what they feel is most important for admissions to know about them. Sometimes we get a lot of questions about what are you looking for in the essay? And the answer is we're looking for them. And we don't want all the essays to look the same. We just want to learn more about that student. Additionally, these essays are also an opportunity to address any questions or any inconsistencies that could be found in other parts of the application. So maybe in Wilson's case, that we see that he was getting a lot of those C's in math, and so maybe we start to learn a little bit more about why he's more interested in history or the humanities versus math. Or it might be something specific about that class and the transition that he had, which again we saw that he did transition from a different school. So again, this all starts to come into play, and so you see that we're now talking a little bit about what we saw in the transcript in the essays as well. I think another part to be able to make sure when it comes to the common application that with those two different essays, that the personal essay is going to all the schools that the student is applying to with the common application. So they might be applying to 7 different schools because the common application makes it easy to do so. But know that personal essay goes to all those schools, whereas the supplemental essays are going to be very specific to those to that specific school. So the supplemental essay for Macalester might be different from the supplemental essay for the other. Is going to be different, as if the other schools even require a supplemental essay or not. So when it really comes to that, what we want students to be able to avoid is redundancy, which we saw a little bit of that in the other application in the essays that we read. But more than anything, that's probably more so because that was a really big part of that student's experience. So at least if they're going to do that, have different, I guess, points of view about why they're kind of like sharing that story in that way. Additionally, telling other people's story and not sharing enough about themselves. Sometimes they have that mentor or that grandmother or a friend who has really had a really big impact on them. And sometimes you get so wrapped up into that story that they forget to actually write about themselves. And I learn more about their grandparents. I learn more about their mentors, and they might be a great person to actually admit to the school. But we want to learn more about you. And so again, that opportunity, really understanding that these are opportunities for the student to particularly share about themselves. And Ariel, can you share a little bit about, I guess, the supplemental essays and what that means for specific schools?
Yeah, absolutely. So here at Macalester, we have a supplemental essay because we want to give students the opportunity to talk about their unique backgrounds and identities and really share with us sort of why and how they would be a good fit here at Macalester. And so that's a great opportunity for students to talk about their values, and if there's any alignment between the students' values and the institution's values, that's a great place to write about that. And to do, I think students who do a little bit of research about the particular schools that they're applying to and really get a sense of what's important to this college, what's important to the students, staff, and faculty there, and get a grounding in those values, then if those values align with theirs, it's a great place to tell us about how they resonate with you. And sometimes it doesn't even happen in that sort of spelled out of a way. Oftentimes students will write about their backgrounds and identities, and we'll see that they have these connections to their multicultural backgrounds or whatever it might be, and we get a sense of fit with Macalester through those essays. And the one other thing I'll say too is that this is such an important part of the application and really a place where students can shine and use their unique voices. Sometimes I think students write the essays that they think admissions counselors want to read, but if a student just uses their voice and tells their authentic story, that comes through in a big way. So we just want to encourage students to really speak from the heart. It's okay to be vulnerable. That's a courageous thing, and we really encourage that.
Absolutely. So now we're going to get into the school report and learning more about that academic context the students coming from.
Yes, so for those of you college, high school counselors, this is a really, really important page, so please take your time with it if you're able. One thing that we look very closely at is these school profile notes, so the graduating class size, the percentage of students who go to four-year colleges or two-year colleges, what is the demographic breakdown of the school, just to really help us understand students within their context and what's available to them. So please list those, the number of honors classes or APs or IBs available at the school on this page so we can see that clearly. And then this part of the school profiles, the school report is also very important. We do take a close look at those ratings, and please be honest, of course. If we see like you've checked all top few for every student coming from your school, then we sort of wonder if that's if that's just if that's not as accurate. So it's actually very helpful to see that range of checks if that's you know, what you feel and what you feel is accurate. We do also pay attention to the curriculum, whether you've checked demanding or very demanding and what's available. This is one of the first places we go to see, is this student an IB diploma candidate, and that sort of thing. And then, of course, if your school has a profile, please, please, please include that. We could have a whole nother webinar on how to create great school profiles, and instead we just included one as an example in this case. So these, of course, are great in terms of getting depth and details, but it's so important to have those accurate numbers on that school report page filled out by you so that we don't have to go digging through these necessarily to find those. And sometimes even when there's no school profile or a counselor does not fill out the numbers on that page, then we might have to go to the school's website and try to look for it there, and we just have so little time. So the best way for you to advocate for your students is to make sure that the numbers you're giving us match the profile and that you're giving us as many details as possible.
Absolutely. And so again, in that, we also know that these school reports and school profiles usually come with a counselor's letter of recommendation, but that's not always the case. Sometimes it might be a new counselor who doesn't know their caseload very well, so they can't really write much about the student, or maybe they're at a school where there's 1,000 students and only 1,000 students in the senior class alone, and there's only 3 counselors. So they don't even have the time to actually be able to do that. If a counselor doesn't provide a letter of recommendation, that student is not at a disadvantage, because again, that's what the context tells us. I could understand a counselor not being able to write many letters when they have 400 and 500 students on their caseload. Mm-hmm. And so I think this is an excellent point to then point out the relationship that schools have with their CBOs as well, and that sometimes if a school doesn't provide the info, or they may be missing certain parts of the context, CBOs can absolutely step in and provide more context both about the school, the area, and the individual student as well. So we're providing one example of what we get from one of our CBOs, the Schuler Scholars Program, where we start to get a lot more information about how they work with their students, learning more about their program, the types of programs that they work with, and where they're coming from. And so again, as we learn more about the CBO, it really excites us as an institution to want to be able to kind of like reach out and work more with them, because we know that they're going to be an excellent source of amazing students who are not just adding to our classes academically, but they're adding diversity to our campus as well. And what college or institution wouldn't want amazing students like that on their campus? So again, if you and I know sometimes that there's some CBOs that don't know, they feel like they don't have a profile. Generally, you have a lot of information for that because you're probably, putting a lot of information for like annual reports for fundraising purposes, or things like that. That again, that same information is going to be really helpful for us as well about, again, who you're working with, why you're working with the students that you're working with, and where those students are going as well. And so again, I think it's an excellent opportunity to be able to kind of like provide more information about your organization and how the student that you are advocating for, how are they standing out in their context.
And the Schuler Scholars are an example of a CBO where the counselors that students work with through Schuler actually write their counselor letters of recommendation. So please feel free to do that if you are on the CBO side, whether that's in place of or simply in addition to those letters of rec.
Absolutely. So then, in the instance that a counselor is giving a counselor letter of recommendation, generally they're going to provide some information and some context for the student. In this case, this was a student for Brittany, a counselor for Brittany, and we see that in this case, the counselor declined to send an evaluation for the student, and that was because, again, that they just didn't know Brittany very well, or they just didn't have the time to be able to do that. So again, in these cases, that's where that either letter of recommendation can either come from you if you have that relationship with the school, which I would always encourage as a CBO or a college access program, that you're really leaning into and providing information to the school that you're working with, because again, it's a partnership and you guys are helping each other both ways, and so you are getting information that can be helpful for the school as well, and again, you can be that additional support for the student. And so when it comes to those letters of recommendation, at least come from the counselors, generally speaking, I'll probably say about 90% of the letters that we get are really, they're kind of confirming what we already know about the student. They're saying that the student is great. They have been excellent students and they're excellent on campus. And you get like 10% of the ones that are really, really good. They go above and beyond to really try to support that student and really know the student in their situation, are able to advocate for them in a process in that way. But you also get another kind of like 10% that are not very helpful at all, or they actually are not advocating for the student at all. And sometimes that happens as well. So that's more of a hopefully the student is selecting people that are able to advocate and support for them in the process when it comes to letters of recommendation. But generally, most letters are just confirming the excellence that the student already has. When it comes to those letters, it's important to know that a longer letter does not equal a better letter. With all the different files that we have to read over the course of the year, again, that it's a 4 or 5 page letter is not going to make the student even more excellent, because usually also what's happening is that there's a lot of additional information that actually isn't helpful to the cause that happens there. So we don't need long letters. We just need letters that are getting to the facts, that they're giving us the information that we need to know about the student. And in some cases, that might need to be just in bullet form, and like you don't have the time to write full narratives and stuff like that, and that's absolutely okay. So again, just as long as we're getting the information that we need, that's the most important part. And again, this is also an additional place to be helpful for the student in terms of addressing any inconsistencies in the application, and in addressing it in some of these counselor recommendations or additional letters of recommendation. That in doing that, it allows the student more space to actually write freely about themselves and other things that are important to them when it comes to their essays. So we would always advocate avoiding from using a template, because sometimes when you use that template, what happens is that counselors can forget to update information for the last student that they were talking about. So we might be talking about Brittany, but we see John's name in there, and now we're confused as to what's going on. Additionally, as Ariel spoke to a little bit before, that some students might find themselves gender fluid or on that spectrum, and we just would love it if counselors are also respecting the students' preferred gender pronouns, because then in that way we can also know that we're making sure that we're addressing the student the right way in all of our subsequent communications with that student. And again, avoid the fluff. I'm sure that you're all are very well educated, so I know that you can write very well. But again, the fluff isn't as necessary, and it isn't as important as, again, us getting to know the student and getting to the point about what they would be able to add in a academic environment or a school environment or community as well. So yeah, so for some other considerations to think about before we wrap up, a few things to kind of like think about that also take place in the application are discipline and school interruptions. And so again, in some cases that students have transferred schools, or they have a bit of an uncommon schooling experience, that they have opportunities to be able to write more about that. Additionally, if they have had any type of discipline issues in the past, I know there's just a healthy kind of like debate going on about do students have to provide this information or not. Again, I think the more important thing is that if a student is going to provide any information about discipline, school interruptions, or again, uncommon situations, that no, if they do check that box saying that they have one, they're going to have space to be able to provide more context for that. And so again, I think it's just important for students to be able to provide more info, more context, and understanding how have they come through that to bring them to where they are in their current place right now. Because again, sometimes things happen, again, in the just the youthfulness and kind of like things that come with that. And again, as students are maturing over the course of high school, especially as they're entering college, that again, just knowing how they learn from all these different situations that they've gone through is going to be the most important part from there. Additionally, you're going to have additional information essays, where again, that's another free space to provide any additional context that the student wants to provide about something that might seem not clear from another part of the application. And the same thing for special circumstance essays, that you have more and more chances to be able to provide more context and more information if it seems like it just couldn't be answered there in the essays. Do you want to talk a little bit about resumes?
Yeah. So if a student has a resume that they've worked hard to create, certainly feel free to encourage them to include it in their application. But what we want to emphasize today is that we will look over that resume, but it's very important that a student still lists out those extracurricular activities and the honors and everything else, and uses the parts of the Common Application that are designated for those things, and doesn't just assume that we'll read the resume and then leaves all the extracurricular section blank. So it's very important that whatever is important to them that's on their resume is also communicated throughout the rest of the application. So if a student has one, great. If not, that's also okay. We're not going to dock them points for not having a resume.
Absolutely. Additionally, when it comes to interactions with staff, I think that kind of like feeds a little bit into demonstrated interest and understanding how does that come into play. And I think there's two kind of like ways to think about demonstrated interest. I think that with more and more technology, schools moving over to platforms like Slate and so on, that again, we get a lot of information about a student's kind of like interest in our school. We know what websites they've gone to. We know if they've replied to messages that we've sent out, or if we actually got a message to them that we wanted to make sure that we can kind of like see all that and have that history. So again, that's one thing, like we track kind of like that information. And then the use of demonstrated interest in terms of actually making application decisions is another thing. So for us, that we don't use demonstrated interest for our admissions decisions, but we're definitely taking a look at that information in other places. And so it's just important to know that. And again, I think additional pieces, demonstrated interest, the fact that the student took time to fill out this application and apply, is telling us the student is interested as well. But just know that different schools are going to fall in different places when it comes to that demonstrated interest. And so again, taking those opportunities to interact with staff, whether that's over email, over phone, if they're visiting your school, take advantage of that. If they're going to be doing a program in the area, take advantage of that as well. Because again, that information does come into handy at some point, even if they're not being used for admissions decisions, that again, wanting to be able to use that information to know how we can better interact with students from different types of communities. All that data is helpful for us. Yeah.
And just to say a little bit more about that, part of the reason why we don't use demonstrated interest to make admissions decisions is because it's a matter of access and equity, and we understand that not every student can make it to our campus, and we don't want to disadvantage students who don't have the resources or maybe don't have the college counseling or support to know that they should be reaching out to colleges and sending all these emails and that sort of thing. So we really want to be sure that that we have a very fair and equitable process, and that's part of how we do that. But also for students who are emailing us or calling us, just a reminder to encourage your students to to use their best writing skills in those emails and to be very professional in their communication with us, since we do see those when we're reading the application. But then again, the reminder that they don't come down to whether or not a student is admitted or not.
Absolutely. And then the last thing with recommendation letters coming from teachers, that understanding that you as counselors can also be really helpful to teachers in the process. So if there's any opportunities to kind of like do some maybe like service learning for the teachers that you interact with, and help kind of like give them some of those same considerations that we were talking about for counselor recommendations, apply to teacher recommendations as well. That they have the opportunity to do, they have ratings that they'll do on their letters as well. And again, when it comes to talking about the student, same thing. Most of them are completely fine. They're kind of like confirming that the student is great. And some go above and beyond, and some fall a little bit below. But more than anything, just making sure that they're being there and advocating for the students. And in some cases, you can help those teachers with how they write their letters as well. So with that, that gives us time. I know that Ben has been busy chopping away at some questions. I know he was collecting some good ones for us, so we'll take some of those questions now.
All right, so there were quite a few questions about CBOs and their role within the application process. In particular, where a CBO or when and where a CBO is able to step in and perhaps write a letter of recommendation in place of a high school counselor rec or in addition to a rec. Questions also about whether or not CBOs should provide some kind of data in lieu of a school profile not being there, and sort of where that landscape of CBOs can provide or fill in some of the gaps that might be present at, in particular, larger public high schools with big caseloads.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when it comes to where CBOs can definitely provide that information, I think whether you do it in lieu of the counselor's letter or not, I think that one excellent space that you would have to be able to provide that is an additional letters of recommendation. So just know that we require the school profile where the counselor can submit a letter, and then we require 2 letters of recommendations to come from the teachers. Additionally, students have the opportunity to do an additional letter of recommendation as well. Generally, we try to limit that to 1 because again, you start to get to 3 and 4 and 5 additional letters and they're starting to say the same thing. But if there were any time that a student was going to have an additional letter of recommendation, it can come from the CBO, that would be an excellent place to be able to write on behalf of the student. And then generally speaking, that you can just attach the CBO profile or data about the CBO along with the letter. It's all going to come in PDF form. And so in that, you can provide more context about the student. So that way we are understanding the right way of how to kind of like understand the student in that context.
Yeah, and the only other thing I would add is really understanding the importance of who writes those letters of rec. So if you work for one of these community-based organizations and you know a student incredibly well through your work with them through the CBO, we would love to see that letter because you know that student so intimately. But also in terms of the teacher letters of recommendation, making sure that they're coming from teachers in core academic areas, so English, math, social studies, science, or foreign language. A teacher letter of rec from one of those disciplines as opposed to perhaps a coach or even maybe a band teacher or something like that. Those don't carry quite as much weight as teachers from those core academic areas. So encouraging and really empowering students to be brave and ask the teachers from those core academic areas for those letters of rec, and then additional letters of rec are certainly encouraged, but as Yancey said, once we start seeing maybe 7 or so, that gets to be a little much.
Yeah, but again, I think that's helpful. Again, providing that data, providing that information, because again, if we come across a great student who's a part of a CBO that we haven't heard of before, that again gives incentive for us as an admissions office to be like, well, that was a great student and they're part of this program. We want to learn more about the program. That might increase the chances of us being able to go and actually visit or at least plan that into future travel plans as well. So again, having that information, providing that information, and allowing us to learn more about the organization and the students that you work with is always a plus.
So another question or a combination of questions that came in was about students struggling with mental health, such as depression, suicides, or friends who committed suicide. Whether or not that is something that raises red flags for us when reading an essay about that topic or seeing a description about that, and sort of where we find the line of that kind of story being helpful versus being more of a sympathy card.
Sure, you want to take that?
Yeah, so we are living in very anxious times, and it's alarming how many students write about their mental health issues. I feel like I don't know any numbers on it, but we read so many applications this last year and the last few years from students who are struggling with depression and anxiety and lots of challenges in their lives. And so we certainly want students to be able to write about that, and as I said earlier, to be able to be vulnerable and tell their unique story. And a lot of times that does include struggle and challenge, whether that's because of outside forces, things at home, mental health, etc. So certainly students can write about that, and I wouldn't say it's a red flag by any means, but we do sort of document when a student talks about struggling with something in particular, so that we can send along notes to our student affairs staff to say, hey, we know that this group of students has struggled or is struggling with depression or something else. We want to be sure that they have support once they get to campus. And so that's sort of an additional piece that we provide to ensure that students who are struggling get the support that they need once they're here.
Absolutely.
All right, so then there were a couple sort of smaller questions. One is how we view dual enrollment classes as far as amount of rigor compared to something like an AP or an IB class.
Yeah, absolutely. I think sometimes when it comes to the dual enrollment classes, it really depends on kind of like how the school kind of like does that. So, we don't make kind of like academic recommendations saying that students have to do this or have to do that when, the school is kind of like dictating what the high school dictates what the graduation requirements are. So I think in some cases that if students are doing that and it's kind of like signify to us that that's going above and beyond what is considered rigorous at their school, then I think that's obviously going to be a plus. If a student is doing it and they're kind of doing that to avoid AP or IB classes, then that is, a question that we might have. And that all kind of goes in line with when we're looking at the school report and that part about the curriculum when it asks about the rigor. If we see a student that's taking a bunch of dual enrollment classes and no AP or IB classes, and the counselor says that they're taking a average or demanding versus very demanding or most demanding, that might signal to us that they're avoiding something, or the classes that they're taking are not as strong as they could be. Whereas in other cases, they might do that and it's considered most demanding, meaning that they view it at least as equal to the other classes they offer at the school. So in that, again, I think we really want students to just take advantage of the academic opportunities that are available to them, and it fits what they're interested in as well. And then just understand that again, if a student puts like demanding or average, or if a counselor puts that on a student, that doesn't mean that they have no chance of being able to do well here, because then a student might write and say that they're taking these classes because the classes at this school were actually a better fit for them, because they offered these classes here and they weren't offered at my school, and so forth. So again, the context kind of comes into play in describing all those things. So yeah, so I think sometimes it kind of depends on the school context, which is why the profiles are really important.
And I'll say, because that can sometimes be related to mental health, sometimes students need to step out of their high school and take online classes if something's going on, and then using the additional information or special circumstance essay to tell us a little bit more about why they chose that change in their curriculum, or that change of school or whatever it might be. So really taking advantage of those opportunities in the Common Application to advocate for themselves and to tell more of the full picture of their story and their choices.
So another question that came in a little bit ago was about the place of resumes in the application file and whether or not that actually adds anything if the applicant is already listing those activities in their activities list.
Yeah, I mean, I would personally say that, again, for the most part, I consider the application the resume. And so in that, if it's them listing the same things that are already kind of like in the application, then I don't think they need to add a resume per se, because we're getting a lot of information about them from there. If it's kind of pointing out additional information, or maybe it's an opportunity maybe to share more kind of like activities that they're taking part in outside of what's on the activities list. So maybe it's a way for them to get around listing 10 and they can slide a few more into the resume. I can see why they would do that. But again, the important thing also remembering the activities is that you should want to get all the impact and the stuff that you want us to catch your eye out in the beginning. Because like, I guess technically speaking, where it shows up in the application when we're reading it is usually like the last page of the application. It kind of goes in after what was loaded from the Common Application. So again, you don't want to bank in us making sure that we catch something in the resume if you can put it in the application and make sure that we see it there.
Yeah, and some CBOs and some classes might even require students to create a resume, and that's such a great way for students to learn that skill as early as high school. So if a student already has a resume or is working on their resume, certainly feel free to include it, but it is not a requirement, at least for Macalester.
I've got a couple questions came in just now about letters of rec, and in particular, what class subjects we look for recs from. And that it seems to be a sense from some of these people in the audience that students are hesitant to ask for recs from different fields of study, that they'll ask for 2 recs, particularly in STEM, or 2 recs in the humanities and not one of each. How do we feel about that? And also, how do we feel about recs from classes like a psych class or an econ class or computer science class, and whether that factors into those core subjects that we look for?
Yes, certainly. Yep. Sorry. Yeah. So, yep, psychology, computer science, all of that fits in. I'd say that, choosing teachers who know you well, who know the students well, is important. And if those 2 letters of rec both come from STEM, maybe one math teacher, one science teacher, that's okay. That still meets that sort of preferred, it's not a requirement per se, but we want to see those core academic subject areas. So that certainly fits within. Anything to add?
Yeah, I would just say that again, in our case, because we're not admitting by major or by department, that again, I think it's more important that the student is really thinking about the teachers that kind of know them the best and can advocate for them the best. Because in that they might say that they want to do STEM now, they might get here, and again, the beauty of the liberal arts is they're getting exposed to so many different things, and majors can change and ideas can change. So it's not so much important for us specifically that they have to be from aligned to the same subject or anything like that. It's more so as long as they can really vouch for the student in that way, it's going to be the most important. But I can see how for other schools that might be more of a thing if they are applying to schools where you're being admitted by major, and that's important to be able to have a recommendation that can vouch for their abilities in that subject. But again, I would also venture to say that they're going to be schools like that will definitely be wanting to rely on first and foremost the transcript and how they're performing in those classes, and then those test scores and other things before they then get to that. So I would say in the grand scheme of things, it's not as important to necessarily have that alignment in terms of subject, but more so that the teachers that are recommending them can actually vouch for them and their abilities as a student, both in the classroom as part of the community.
And sometimes we see letters of recommendation from teachers who are within the students' favorite subjects, and that's great. And sometimes we see letters of recommendation from classes where students really struggled, but that can be a great way for a teacher to highlight, like organic chemistry didn't come easily to this student, but they worked so hard and they advocated for themselves and they used these resources and they came in to meet with me. So really, again, just choosing the teacher who can speak well to the student, whether it's within a subject where they excel or not.
Any last good questions?
Yeah, so there's one more important question that would be great to address for the audience here. Going back to students talking about some of their mental health struggles, maybe some more personal things that they've been going through. And particularly the discrepancy between students really wanting to share those powerful stories, and yet their parents may be thinking that counseling officers, that admissions offices will review those as red flags only and not as adding value to the application. And so if you could just clarify for our counseling audience in particular, why we do want to hear those stories.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the 2 things that I can think of is that one, because again, we want to be able to support those students when they get here to campus as well. So being able to have that information at that time, so then that way, as they are then, if they are then admitted, and then they are then enrolling as part of our incoming class, that we're making sure they're getting connected to the right resources, so that way they can be successful once they get here to campus. And then secondly, I think it's an opportunity for a student to kind of talk about their progression and their growth and how they have dealt with different things in their lives. And so again, I think with the idea of a student that might be going through some type of mental health challenge, I think the point in putting that in an application is not so much to list it and just leave it, but you're more so talking about that how have you worked with that challenge, and how have you gotten over that challenge, or how are you dealing with that challenge to be able to move forward and be successful? Because again, if you're just kind of like listing it and it's kind of like throwing everything off course and that's where you left it at, then that's telling us that are you ready to matriculate to college? That leaves that question there. So more so if you're going to put it there, because it's an opportunity to talk about something that you're dealing with in your life, and then in that how you've gotten over it. So then that way, you know how to kind of like get over challenges, because we know that there's going to be many more challenges once they get to the college campus as well. So that's just an example of them being able to overcome a challenge that they might have to deal with.
And sometimes we see there's a dip in performance. Students were getting all A's and maybe some B's or whatever, and then all of a sudden they have a really rough semester where things just drop off, and we think, what's going on? And if a student writes about and maybe uses that additional information section to talk about how they lost a family member or something tragic that happened in their life and they weren't able to perform at the high level they had been performing at before, we get that. We're all human and we all go through tough stuff. And so we don't expect that students are going to be able to perform at their best when they're going through some serious challenges. And so that's why it's so important to use those opportunities to tell student stories so that we can understand if there's been a change in their performance, or if we just see something out of the blue, but then there's no explanation for it, we can't make any assumptions. And so the more a student is able to tell us and advocate for themselves, the clearer the picture becomes for us. And
the more we can advocate for them.
Exactly. And in addition to that, this wasn't specifically asked, but if students have learning differences, don't feel like you have to shy away from talking about that. That is great for us to know, because then we can make sure that they can get connected to our Academic Excellence Center and get the support and accommodations that they need.
Absolutely.
So just got the nudge from Brittany that we have time for one more question.
Okay.
So I think continuing on with some of the discussion about mental health and personal stories and bringing those in, some of these counselors are working with students who don't get over involved in things because they want to take time for their mental health and to have some sleep and to be able to focus on themselves. And so there have been a few questions along the lines of, does a student get penalized more or less if they don't have a complete list of activities that they're involved in, but if say they have a full-time job instead, or if they are really taking some time for some personal mental health? How do we see that as opposed to a student who has, a dozen activities for 20 hours a week each?
Yeah, so again, things like jobs, whether it's a part-time job, full-time job, internship, whatever way it is, again, listing things like that in the extracurricular activities, it is an extracurricular activity. In some cases, a student might have family responsibilities where they have to take care of a younger sibling or maybe an elder in the family. That again, those are also extracurricular activities. And so again, if a student does then share that they are, kind of like, that's where the additional information might come into play. They can mention that again, that you might see that I don't have a lot of different activities because this is what I do to kind of like maintain my mental health. Again, the big thing with the application is not trying to leave us with questions. So if that is something that a student is kind of like, that's their situation, as long as they kind of like express that in the application, we have that as context to talk about when we're moving through and getting to the point of discussions when we're reading, and discussions when we get to committee as well. So again, I think that's absolutely fine. It's important to make sure that you're using these different sections of the application to kind of like lay some of those things out, because again, we don't want to make assumptions. And again, you also can't assume that the person that's reading the application is going to be fully understanding of the situation if you don't kind of like spell that out. So any places that you can provide more context is going to be better.
Yeah, absolutely. Great.
All right.
Well, thank you all so much.
All right, team. Yeah, I am going to go ahead and transition. But first, I would like to say thank you so much to the Macalester team. I have to say, this is one of the best discussions that I've had experienced. So a round of applause for you all, and thank you, counselors, for providing us with such great questions. We want you all to take some time out to complete the post survey so that you can share your feedback with the Macalester team. They will receive a report of all of the questions that we asked you during the registration, and they will review that with their team. And there is an opportunity for you all to share any new topics that you would like them to cover in the future. Actually, this topic was a suggested topic from one of our counselors. So we hear your feedback. We really appreciate you all providing us with a little bit more of a pulse of what's needed on the ground. Okay. And then for upcoming webinars, we have our amazing content team who has released our updated college fly-in list for the updated upcoming school year. And to complement the release, we are hosting an online panel discussion with our partner colleges. The webinar will be scheduled on Tuesday, May 21st at 2 p.m. Central Time. We will be sending the registration link to you all shortly, so just keep an eye out for an email from myself or the College Greenlight team. The panel will focus on highlighting their programs, but we're really going to focus on best practices to help our students put their best foot forward in the applications as college fly-ins are becoming more competitive. So we hope to have you all there. And to my Macalester team, thank you so much for taking on this challenge. I have presented this idea to so many colleges, and they were like, no. But this is great. It was informative. I hope that there is an opportunity to do a part 2. Again, do you guys have any remarks that you would like to say before we close out?
Well, thank you, Brittany, for helping us get this all together. We're really excited to be able to have this partnership with College Greenlight and to be able to work with the counselors. And so we're just really excited about moving ahead in this work with you.
And I just want to thank you all for your questions. I think this was a great discussion. Please continue to send questions our way. Really appreciate the thought and care with which you asked those questions today.
Thank you all for tuning in. For those of you who did not have your questions answered, we will be doing some follow-up just to make sure you aren't left hanging and that you feel like your time is being utilized.
All right, team. We're going to sign off. Thank you so much, everyone. We will be sending a recording in Slack for you all to review at your convenience. And please share with colleagues. All right. Bye, everyone.